The meeting had no official name on any calendar. No agenda distributed in advance, no minutes taken by a secretary, no recording device left running on the long lacquered table. The 12 people in that room, 9. Commission officials, 2 legal advisors, and 1 man who had not introduced himself and would not existed for the duration of that evening as a gathering that had never happened. Outside Tokyo hummed through the glass. 22 floors below the city moved the way it always did. Trains on scheduled crosswalks, cycling green to red, the faint glow of agency billboards, cycling through the ranked faces of licensed heroes. The Hero Billboard Chart's quarterly update had run 3 days prior. Everything to the public eye looked like a system that worked. Inside the room, the commission's president set a single printed report face down on the table and did not immediately turn it over. She opened with an instruction, not a briefing. I want everyone here to understand what we are not doing. We are not escalating to the diet. We are not convening a full commission session. We are not issuing a public advisory. One of the legal advisors, younger, still cautious enough to ask, replied, "Then what are we doing? Managing." She let the word stand on its own, the way we always have. She turned the pages over. The report covered 14 pages. The first 3 summarized what the room already knew in fragments. A cascading series of quirk-related incidents along the industrial corridor northeast of Nagoya. 3 hero agencies operating past capacity for 61 consecutive days. A suppression of villain activity in Kyushu that should have relieved pressure, but had instead displaced it northward, like water finding a new crack. The 4th page introduced a number the room had not seen before, a projected failure threshold for coordinated response capacity expressed not in days, but in a range. The low end of that range was uncomfortably close. "This is the model broker provided," the president said. "The same model that called Sendai 6 weeks before anyone else saw it coming. The same model that gave us the window on the March operation." She paused. That one was filed under a sealed internal code. It never touched a police database. You all know what it cost not to use it sooner. No one at the table said the word broker aloud. The man who had not introduced himself sat at the far end with his hands folded and his face arranged into something that communicated patience without warmth. He was not young. He was not old. He wore no logo, carried no badge, and had arrived through a service entrance that the building's security log would later show no record of. A senior official, the one who oversaw hero licensing in the Kanto region, leaned forward. "The model's accuracy doesn't change the nature of what we're being asked to consider. This," he tapped the pages, "is proposing a deployment option. That's a significant step beyond intelligence analysis." The man at the far end didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The model doesn't propose, it projects. What you choose to do with a projection is your business. I'm here as a courtesy." "A courtesy?" the licensing official answered in a tone that made the word taste like something left too long in the sun. "You reached out to us twice," the man continued. "Both times under pressure. Both times with results you found satisfactory. I assumed you'd want the same quality of service going forward." The president let that settle, then moved to the final section. The room read in silence. The air recycling system ran quietly overhead. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered and stopped. The final section was not long. It outlined a single contract option, not detailed, not named, referred to throughout only as the deployment provision. The terms were structured around a performance-based engagement, a defined scope, a defined duration, a payment structure contingent on resolution, and a liability clause that had been written with unusual care. One line near the bottom had been underlined in pen, presumably by someone who had read it before bringing it into this room. The executing party shall not be bound by the domestic regulatory frameworks of the contracting jurisdiction for the duration of active engagement. The younger legal advisor read that line twice. Then he looked up. This is a liability waiver for actions taken outside our legal system. The man answered with the ease of someone who had explained this before. It's a standard operational clause. Your framework wasn't designed with this category of engagement in mind. It would create contradictions. The clause removes them. The advisor looked up from the page. It removes accountability. It removes paperwork, the man replied. Accountability is built into the contract itself. The executing party completes the scope or forfeits payment. Non-performance carries its own penalties, and we have one prior client who tested that. The consequences arrived before the next sunrise. You don't need domestic courts for enforcement. The mechanism is self-contained. The licensing official set the pages down with enough deliberateness to communicate a position without stating it. I'd like to know what we're actually deploying. Not the clause, the asset. Details are provided after signature, the man said. Standard procedure. Due diligence occurs at the point of engagement, not at the point of sale. You're not buying an asset. You're buying a deadline. That's not, the licensing official began. Acceptable, I know. The man's tone carried no malice, the way someone states the boiling point of water. You'll say that, and then you'll look at page 4 again, and then you'll make a decision. That's how it works. It's how it's always worked with you. The room went quiet again. The president looked at the window. The city was still out there, ranked heroes, scheduled trains, agency logos cycling through their rotation. Everything that made the surface appear stable. She thought about the threshold number. She thought about Sendai. She thought about the March operation, which had resolved in 72 hours and generated no press coverage, and the quiet satisfaction she had permitted herself for exactly one evening before moving to the next file. If we proceed, she said, this stays within this room. No full commission disclosure. Authorization runs through the 9 of us and the legal buffer. She glanced at the advisors. You were not here. The younger advisor kept his silence. The older one had been with the commission for 19 years and had learned which silences were the ones you kept. The president looked around the table. She did not call a formal vote. Formal votes left records. Instead, she looked around the table. Anyone who objects should say so now. 8 seconds passed, and then she picked up her pen. She did not sign immediately. She read the underlined line one more time. The executing party shall not be bound by the domestic regulatory frameworks of the contracting jurisdiction. She thought a spool of thread. That's what they were giving themselves. Something to hold on to while they lowered a bucket into a dark well. They were not being reckless. They were being practical. There was a difference. She had always believed there was a difference. She signed. The man at the far end produced a second copy from inside his jacket. Clean, pre-filled, already waiting, and slid it across the lacquered surface without standing. The president countersigned the duplicate. One copy stayed. One copy left with him back through whatever door he had arrived by. By the time the other 11 people had gathered their things and drifted toward the elevator bank, the papers were already in transit, not filed, not logged. Moving. The contract had been activated. The ping arrived in the small hours of the morning, just before 3:30. Not an alarm, not a klaxon. A single soft tone on a device that had no manufacturer's label, no registered serial number, and lived in a drawer inside the commission's secure operations room on the 14th floor. The duty officer on shift. A woman who had worked 12-hour rotations for 6 years and had learned to read the difference between noise and signal. Before her coffee cooled, pulled the drawer open and looked at the screen. One line of text. No sender ID. Clause 3 contact point coordinates, transmission confirmed. Below it, a set of GPS coordinates resolving to a location in western Shinjuku, 18 blocks from the nearest licensed agency headquarters. She stared at it for 4 seconds. Then she picked up the internal line and called upstairs. Within the next quarter hour, the operations room had 11 people in it. Shortly after the president had been reached at her residence and was on a secure call, still in the clothes she had not yet changed out of from the evening prior. The coordinates were cross-referenced against the contact provision. Buried in Clause 3 of the deployment provision, the clause that specified HPSC would supply an initial meeting point through the secure channel upon contract activation. They had supplied it 3 days ago, as instructed. A formality, the legal advisor had called it. A placeholder. He used it. The duty officer looked at the screen, then at the room. No one responded. The senior coordinator, a compact man in his 50s, who ran crisis logistics with the affect of someone perpetually behind on sleep, pulled up the satellite overlay and zoomed to the coordinates. An empty block. A cleared lot that had been slated for mixed-use development for 2 years and sat unused in the gap between a convenience store and a parking structure. Someone said quietly, "We gave him that address." The coordinator didn't look up from the satellite overlay. "Yes, we did." The first indication reaching public awareness was not visual. It was seismic. Around 20 minutes later, 3 monitoring stations in the greater Tokyo area registered a localized impact event. Not an earthquake, the geological signature was wrong, originating approximately 4 kilometers west of the designated coordinates. The contact point wasn't the landing site, it was the appointment. The deviation was logged cross-referenced against no known hero operation currently active and flagged as unclassified at the same moment that the traffic management system on Route 20 began reporting cascading sensor failures moving east at a pace inconsistent with any ground vehicle. Hawks was in the air within minutes. He had been on standby since the prior evening. Not because anyone had formally told him why, but because the commission had a way of scheduling his availability around events it hadn't officially announced yet. And he had long since stopped pretending not to understand that pattern. The night air over western Tokyo was clear and cold. He flew high feathers spread wide to catch thermal's eyes cutting through the amber wash of city lights below. Then the thing landed. He felt it before he saw it. A pressure wave rolling outward like a stone dropped into still water. Except the stone was moving and the water was air, and the ripple traveled faster than it had any reason to. Car alarms activated across 4 city blocks in sequence. A construction crane on a half-finished tower in Hatagaya swung 2 degrees off its moorings and held there groaning. Every piece of surveillance glass in a 3-block radius vibrated at a frequency just below the threshold of shattering. Hawks pulled his wings in and dropped 50 meters before leveling off. His earpiece was already live. "All units." Hawks kept his voice flat. "We have an unclassified arrival event, western Shinjuku. Civilian evacuation protocol sectors 7 through 11. I need ground teams on Route 20 northbound and the Koshu-Kaido interchange. Move people away from the lot on clause coordinates. Yes, those coordinates, you have them, and do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." A beat of silence on the channel, then his ground coordinator. "What are we evacuating from?" Hawks looked down. Standing in the cleared lot, surrounded by a shallow crater of displaced asphalt that fanned outward like a starburst, was something that did not belong to any catalog he had access to. Tall, pale, black hair hanging loose past armored shoulders, a hook chain coiled at one hip like a sleeping predator. The figure stood with the posture of a man who had just stepped off a transit bus, not triumphant, not threatening, occupying space the way a load-bearing wall occupies space. The figure looked up. Even from altitude, even through the amber-dark hawks, had the distinct impression of being assessed and filed away in approximately 1 second. He keyed the earpiece. Evacuate from that. 3 units reached the lot before Lobo left it. The first, a 4-man rescue team, redirecting civilian foot traffic on the south approach, registered as an obstacle. Lobo walked through their perimeter the way a person walks through a bead curtain, without slowing, without looking, with one hand extended to move the nearest body aside. The hero at the front of the line was a licensed pro with 7 years of field experience and a quirk rated for structural reinforcement. He flew 12 meters and hit a chain-link fence and slid down it and sat on the pavement breathing carefully while his 3 colleagues stood very still. The second unit, 2 aerial responders who moved to flank from above, peeled off when Lobo glanced upward. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't change pace. He looked up, the way you look up when you hear a fly, and something in that look communicated with complete efficiency that flanking was not going to be a productive use of anyone's time. The third unit had the sense not to move at all. Lobo walked 18 blocks to the contact point. He could have crossed the city in seconds. He chose not to. The pace he kept was unhurried, deliberate, the pace of a man making a point about who is waiting for whom. Around him, the city's evacuation machinery ground into motion, sirens in the middle distance, loudspeaker instructions in Japanese cycling through emergency cadences, the low percussion of helicopter rotors somewhere to the northeast. None of it was about him. All of it was because of him. He reached the coordinates roughly an hour after the ping. The contact point was a parking structure level 2 northeast corner, chosen because it had no windows facing a public street and no sight lines from adjacent buildings above the 3rd floor. 4 commissioned personnel were already positioned. 2 stood near a folding table with a briefcase on it. 2 stood near the stairwell exit, with the body language of people who had been told not to reach for anything. Lobo looked at the room. He looked at the suits. He looked at the briefcase. Contract. The senior contact designated liaison, who had rehearsed this opening exchange 3 times on the ride over, began. We want to start by establishing a productive channel of communication between your organization and the Commission, because we believe there's significant mutual benefit in. The word landed again at the same volume, a correction, not a repetition. The man stopped. He opened the briefcase. Inside, a printed copy of the deployment provision, tabbed at 3 sections, with a summary sheet clipped to the front. Lobo picked it up. He read it, not skimmed it, read it moving through each page with the attention of someone checking the fine print on a warranty they intend to use. The 4 men stood in silence for 90 seconds. One of them shifted weight from one foot to the other and stopped when Lobo glanced up. He set the pages on the folding table. Advance. The liaison looked at his colleague. The colleague opened a second compartment in the briefcase, a data chip in a sealed sleeve representing the first payment tranche, wired to an account structure the Commission had been provided through the secure channel and had not asked questions about. Lobo took it. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at it the way a jeweler looks at a stone of uncertain provenance. Who's the mark? The liaison cleared his throat. The scope is compartmentalized. You'll receive target packets as the engagement progresses. So you're paying me to work blind. You're being paid to deliver outcomes, the man answered. We don't have the full asset file. We have the clause, the timetable, and the penalty structure. That's what we were sold. Lobo looked at him for a moment. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a professional recalibrating an estimate not of the job's difficulty, but of its shape. He tucked the chip into a compartment on his belt. "Clause 4, he said, tapping the pages without looking at them. "Not bound by your local rules. Just making sure we both read the same copy." The liaison's answer was quick. "We're aware of the clause." "Good," Lobo said. "Because I don't think you were." He let that land. "Then, keep the press away from the lot. Whatever story you want to run it fast. After today, the story runs itself." He turned toward the stairwell. The two men near the exit moved aside without being asked. Before sunrise, the Commission's communications team had drafted 3 versions of a public statement. The first said nothing about the arrival event and attributed the seismic monitoring anomalies to routine infrastructure testing in the Shinjuku Development Corridor. It was rejected in 4 minutes on the grounds that 3 separate citizen video feeds were already circulating on open networks, and the crater in the empty lot was visible from the Route 20 overpass. The second acknowledged an unscheduled arrival of an international operative and described it as a planned security exercise. It was rejected in 7 minutes because the word unscheduled and the word planned appeared in the same sentence. The third version called him a special ally. The president read it twice. She crossed out special and wrote strategic, and then crossed out strategic and wrote special again. Then she approved it. The press briefing was set for 9 in the morning. Hero agencies would receive talking points before 7. The standard delay buffer, 8 seconds on all broadcast feeds, would stay active. Any footage showing the Shinjuku crater in isolation without the framing context of the Commission statement was to be flagged before amplification. "What do we tell them he's here for?" the communications director asked. The president held the question for longer than was comfortable. Outside, the sky over Tokyo had begun its pale shift toward dawn. The ranked hero faces on the agency billboards cycled through their rotation, patient and well-lit and completely unaware. She held the question longer than was comfortable. "Tell them he's here to help." In the parking structure 18 blocks away, the folding table had been packed up and the detail was gone. The only trace left behind was a set of boot prints pressed into the concrete floor, deeper than the material had any engineering reason to allow, leading from the northeast corner to the stairwell exit, and stopping there as if whatever made them had simply ceased to be present rather than walked away. The city's morning was beginning. Trains back on schedule. Crosswalks cycling green to red. The story, as he had said, would run itself. The press briefing room on the 3rd floor of the Commission's Public Affairs Annex had been designed to project calm. Neutral walls, recessed lighting that softened edges without flattening faces. A podium positioned at a slight elevation, enough to suggest authority without triggering the instinct that reads elevation as threat. The Commission's communications director had overseen 17 major briefings in this room and understood its grammar, fluently controlled, light-controlled framing, controlled language. 27 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin, 27 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin, she stood at the back of the room and looked at the podium and felt the particular nausea of someone who has spent a career building a machine and is about to watch it run in the wrong direction. The delay window had been active since early morning. 8 seconds on every outbound broadcast feed, a standard precaution on high-sensitivity statements, technically described as a technical synchronization window in the Commission's Public Communications Protocol. The buffer had been installed 6 years ago, after an incident involving an unscripted remark by a then-ranking hero during a live threat assessment. It had never actually been used. It existed in practice as a symbol, the idea that someone somewhere had a hand on a switch. Today, they were going to need the hand. The communications director turned away from the podium. "Remind me of the sequence." Her deputy read from the run sheet. Opening statement, 3 minutes. Framing stabilization support, temporary operational engagement, international cooperation precedent. Then we introduce him. He stands at the podium for 60 seconds maximum. We've briefed the camera leads to hold a wide shot, and we take 2 pre-screened questions from our embedded correspondents. No open floor. Cut to the commission spokesperson for closing remarks. Total run time 9 minutes. And if he doesn't follow the sequence, a pause. The 8-second cut gives us a window. The communications director looked at the podium again. He's going to say something in the first 3 seconds. Her deputy had no answer for that. The briefing began on schedule. The commission spokesperson, a career public affairs professional with the controlled vocal cadence of someone trained to make bad news, sound like weather, delivered the opening statement without deviation. Stabilization support, temporary operational engagement, international cooperation precedent. The cameras held their framing. The embedded correspondents sat in the second row with their questions already prepared and their recording equipment properly declared. Then Lobo walked to the podium. He was wearing the same thing he'd arrived in. No one had suggested a change of clothes, and the one staffer who had gestured toward a jacket on a hanger had received a look that ended the conversation before it started. He moved to the podium the way he moved everywhere, unhurried, occupying the full geometry of whatever space he entered. He looked at the teleprompter. The teleprompter displayed the 60-second prepared statement the communications team had spent 4 hours writing. He looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Cute script. The buffer registered the words. Nobody cut the feed. The hand on the switch hesitated, because cutting in the first 5 seconds would itself become the story. And the communications director knew it, and the person at the switch knew she knew it, and so the words went out. Lobo leaned one arm on the podium. He looked at the cameras with the expression of a man at a bar who has just been introduced to someone he finds mildly interesting. "I work for whoever pays," he said. "Right now, that's your commission. Your laws aren't in my contract. Your ranking system isn't in my contract. Whatever they told you, I'm here to do." He glanced sideways at the spokesperson who had gone the color of old plaster. "Ask them to show you the paperwork. Should be a good read." 4 seconds of silence on the feed. Not edited silence. Real silence, the kind that accumulates when a room full of trained communications professionals simultaneously calculates that every available response makes the situation worse. One of the embedded correspondents' second row, pre-screened question about operational parameters broke from script almost involuntarily. "Who authorized your engagement?" Lobo looked at her. "Someone with a pen and a problem, same as always." He stepped back from the podium, not dramatically, not with any performance of departure. He simply stopped being interested in the cameras and walked off the platform, and the spokesperson stepped forward and began speaking very quickly about preliminary operational briefing stages and further context to follow. And the delay buffer was activated for the first time in 6 years, and it was 4 seconds too late. Sound. The feed cut after a 6-minute salvage attempt. They had tried to salvage it. The spokesperson kept talking for 6 minutes, delivering context no one was listening to, while the commission's communications team debated whether pulling the broadcast mid-sentence would compound the damage or contain it. The debate ended when a second monitoring alert showed the clip had already been extracted, trimmed to 30 seconds, and was circulating independently of the broadcast. At that point, cutting the feed was no longer damage control. It was punctuation. Within minutes, the Commission's social monitoring unit was tracking 43 separate narrative threads across open networks. The number kept climbing. The number was 112. By mid-morning, The monitoring software flagged the volume as outside its modeled parameters and requested a human review, and the human reviewer stared at the dashboard for a moment and then sent a message to his supervisor that read, "Only we need more people." Hawks was in the field when the clip circulated. He was directing a secondary evacuation perimeter around a residential block in Shibuya, a precautionary cordon established after the seismic data from Shinjuku. Nothing confirmed standard protocol when his earpiece carried the ambient audio from a convenience store television, and he heard the two sentences. He didn't stop moving. He kept his fierce wings cycling in a widespread monitoring foot traffic, guiding civilians toward the assembly point 3 blocks east. But something in his expression shifted. A small recalibration, the kind that doesn't show unless you're watching for it. The crowd around the cordon was already changing. He could feel it the way you feel a temperature drop, not through any single indicator, but through the aggregate. People who had been compliant 10 minutes ago were now standing still and looking at their phones. A man near the convenience store entrance said something to the woman beside him, and she shook her head twice and pulled her child closer. 2 teenagers on the opposite corner had their screens up and were filming the cordon itself, not the evacuation, filming the heroes, the tape line, the official presence, as if they were documenting a performance rather than responding to one. "Ground units," Hawks said into his earpiece, keeping his voice level. "Expect attitude shift in sectors 4 and 7. Don't escalate. Keep the tone low. We're doing rescue work, not crowd management. Act like it." He banked left and climbed, putting altitude between himself and the street-level friction. From above, the city's evacuation pattern looked orderly. It was only at ground level that you could feel the texture changing. His earpiece buzzed with a priority flag from the Commission's coordination desk. He accepted it. The desk contact's assessment was flat. The briefing didn't land. "I heard. We need top-tier visibility on CIV protection. Real coverage, not just the Commission feed. People need to see heroes working." Heroes are working. Whether people see it the way you want them to is a different problem. A pause. Focus on that separately. Don't conflate them. A silence on the line that communicated the desk had heard this and chosen not to respond to it. A silence then. Understood. Continue your current assignment. Hawks continued. Dank. The call to broker was made an hour later from a room with no windows and one door and a phone line that routed through 3 relay nodes before reaching its destination. The president sat at the table. One legal advisor sat beside her. No one else. The line connected after 2 rings. No greeting, no identification. Just the quality of an open channel, the particular silence of someone who has answered and is waiting for you to justify the call. The president kept her voice level. "We want to discuss modification of the current engagement. Specifically, a suspension or termination of the active clause, pending a revised scope review." The voice was the same as the meeting last week, measured uninflected. "The contract is active. Suspension isn't a provision in the current terms. We're prepared to negotiate an amendment. Amendments require mutual agreement. I don't have instructions to negotiate amendments." A beat. "Cancellation constitutes breach under Section 7. Payment obligations continue regardless of operational status. Non-compliance triggers the penalty structure." "What is the penalty structure?" the legal advisor asked. 3 seconds of silence. Then, "You've seen it operate once already. I'd recommend not requiring a second demonstration." The president looked at the wall. The legal advisor looked at his hands. The president chose her words with care. "Is there any path that doesn't involve continuing the engagement?" "Yes, completion." And the line went quiet, not disconnected, just empty the way a door is empty after someone has already left through it. The president set down the phone. Outside, Tokyo was entering its mid-morning hours. The briefing clip had now been viewed by a number the commission's monitoring system was still tabulating. The story was no longer a single thread. It had branched. By noon, the branches had names. The largest cluster, trending across 3 platforms, simultaneously ran under a question rather than a statement. Who authorized him? Attached to it were screenshots of the briefing, screenshots of the commission's original release. A side-by-side comparison someone had assembled in under an hour, showing the spokesperson's language mapped against Lobo's 2 sentences with the divergences highlighted in red. The comparison had been shared 40,000 times before lunch. A second cluster ran angrier and faster, built around the phrase, government weapon. The theory stated with varying degrees of confidence that the arrival had not been unplanned, that the crater in Shinjuku was not incidental, and that the commission had imported something it could not control as a solution to a problem it had not disclosed. This cluster had a smaller origination point, but a steeper growth curve. Quieter and harder to track, a third thread moved through forums that catered to people who had reasons to distrust the existing hero system. It didn't argue about what Lobo was or who had authorized him. It asked a different question. If he's not bound by their rules, why should we be hawks? Read this cluster from altitude on a secondary device he kept for open network monitoring, while his primary earpiece continued routing coordination traffic. He flagged the third thread to the commission's intelligence desk with a single annotation. Watch this one. It's not about him. On the ground, the evacuation perimeters held. Hero teams continued their work redirecting traffic, securing unstable structures from the seismic event, running welfare checks through the affected residential blocks. The work was real. The effort was genuine. None of the heroes doing it had been briefed on the contents of the deployment provision, and most of them would not have believed it if they had been. At the Commission's Public Affairs Annex, the communications director sat in her office, with the run sheet from the morning still on her desk. She had drawn a single line through the 9-minute projected run time and written the actual time beside it, 4 minutes, 11 seconds. Then she had written one more thing beneath it, in smaller letters, almost private. The buffer existed as a symbol. It still does, just not the symbol we wanted. By early afternoon, the Commission issued a second release. It described the morning briefing as a preliminary introduction and promised a full operational context briefing within 48 hours. It used the phrase stabilization support 4 times and the phrase under commission coordination 3 times. It did not address either of the 2 sentences that had circulated for the past 3 hours. The top heroes received an internal directive 30 minutes later. Priority civilian protection and emergency response. Secondary public visibility on rescue operations. Tertiary listed without elaboration. Avoid direct engagement with the contracted operative pending further guidance. An Endeavor read the directive in the back of a transport vehicle heading toward a structural damage assessment in Narima. He read it twice. Then he folded it once and put it in his pocket and looked out the window. He said nothing, which was itself a form of answer. Hawks filed his midday report, flagged his network monitoring findings, and returned to the air. The city below him was orderly in the way that things are orderly just before they aren't the surface intact, the structure underneath beginning very quietly to shift. The Commission's contain and reframe protocol had been active for 3 hours. Nothing had been contained. Nothing had been reframed. The story was running itself exactly as promised. The ops room map had been updated 4 times since dawn. Each update added heat, not temperature, but the cartographic kind, red zones expanding outward from the Shinjuku crater, like a bruise spreading under skin. Minor incidents at first. A street altercation in Yoyogi between a group of protesters and a countergroup who had decided independently and simultaneously that the same intersection belonged to them. A storefront window in Harajuku, gone at 11:40, logged as unspecified projectile. A hero agency in Shinjuku-ku that had locked its public entrance after two separate individuals arrived within the same hour to, according to the front desk log, file a complaint about the alien. By mid-afternoon, the Commission's Field Coordination Center had 22 active incident flags across the greater Tokyo metropolitan area. Most were minor. None were nothing. The duty coordinator marked each flag with a colored pin and stepped back and looked at the board and announced to no one in particular, "It's a pressure pattern." Nobody asked him to explain. Everyone in the room understood what a pressure pattern meant. Not an explosion, not a riot, not a single dramatic event. A dozen small things happening at the same time, in adjacent locations, each one individually manageable, collectively beyond the staffing math. The directive that came down from the Commission in the late morning was brief and unambiguous. No hero public statements without prior approval. Civilian protection prioritized over asset confrontation. All agency field teams to prioritize evacuation and perimeter maintenance. The word confrontation appeared once and was never defined. Endeavor received the directive in a Commission transport heading northwest toward a structural assessment in Narima. He read it. He folded it. He looked out the window at the city, moving past the same expression he'd worn reading the previous directive, which had contained almost identical language. Then his comms unit flagged a position report. The contracted operative was located in the Nishi Shinjuku Commercial District. Moving on foot. Northbound. Pace unhurried. Endeavor looked at the position report for 4 seconds. Then, he told the driver to redirect. The Nishi Shinjuku district had been partially evacuated since the morning. 2 streets were closed. Traffic rerouted, businesses shuttered behind locked roll-down gates. The hero presence on the ground was visible. 2 rescue teams managing a secondary perimeter. A single aerial unit holding a watch position. 2 blocks west, emergency services on standby at the nearest intersection. Lobo walked through it the way he'd walked through everything else since arriving. As though the infrastructure of human emergency management were a moderate inconvenience rather than a system in operation. The withdrawal corridor parted around him. Not because the personnel scattered, but because they had been told in increasingly urgent terms over the past 6 hours not to engage, and professional discipline held even when instinct wanted to do otherwise. He was looking at a building. The building was a 6-story commercial structure, currently empty per the evacuation, with a hero agency office on the 3rd floor, mid-tier 15. Licensed heroes on roster currently deployed elsewhere. He looked at it the way a person looks at a map reference. Locating, filing it away, moving on. Not scouting targets. Cataloging infrastructure, the kind of operational detail a contractor notes for routing, not for sport. He had moved on approximately 8 meters when Endeavor landed. The impact was controlled. Endeavor never landed sloppily, not in 20 years of active hero work, not under pressure, not in front of cameras. And he came down in the gap between Lobo and the next intersection with the full physical authority of number 1. Flames framed his shoulders. His posture communicated in the language that hero presence had been engineered to communicate. This is where movement stops. I'm not here to fight you. Endeavor's voice carried the flatness of a decision already made. I'm here to establish terms. Lobo stopped. He turned around. He looked at Endeavor the way he had looked at the building, locating, cataloging. Terms. This city has evacuation protocols in effect. You're operating inside civilian zones without coordination. Whatever your contract specifies, it doesn't override the safety of the people living here. Read the clause. I don't care about your clause. Or, then we're done talking. He started walking again. Endeavor moved first. He crossed the distance in under a second and led with flash-fire fist. Not the full prominence burn, not yet, but the accelerated thermal compression that preceded it. The technique that had melted structural steel in documented field reports and made every hero in Japan understand why number 2 had spent years trying to become number 1. His right fist drove forward at a heat output that bent the air around it into visible distortion, trailing a streak of white-orange that left afterburn on the road surface. It connected with nothing. Lobo had turned, not dodged, turned a quarter rotation at the waist, and the fist passed through the space where his ribs had been close enough that the thermal discharge scorched a black streak across his jacket. Then Lobo's left hand came back in a motion that was less a punch than a structural event open palm heel of the hand, the kind of impact that communicates force, not as a sharp thing, but as a fact. It caught Endeavor across the chest. Endeavor went through the roll-down gate of a closed shop front, then through the display fixtures inside, then into the back wall which held. He hit the floor and lay still for 2 seconds. Then he moved first his hand, then his shoulder, then the full controlled sequence of someone assessing damage before attempting to stand. His hell flame was still active. His suit had absorbed most of the kinetic transfer. His ribs would be bruised, but not broken. He had felt broken ribs before, and the texture of this was different. He got to one knee. In the gap where the gate had been, Lobo stood at the edge, looking in. Not with satisfaction, not with contempt. With the same expression he'd had before the hit cataloging. "One hit, and you're done," Lobo said. "I kill when I'm paid, or when someone gets in my way. Today, you're neither." He looked at Endeavor for one more second the way a contractor looks at a minor site obstacle after confirming it doesn't affect the schedule. "Get back up. Clear your people. You're in my schedule." He turned and walked away. Endeavor stood up. It took longer than he would have preferred, and the team from the nearest cordon was already moving toward the shop front. And he waved them off, once no explanation, and stood in the wreckage of the display fixtures and breathed through the bruising and did not say anything. He had felt in the fraction of a second before impact the absolute absence of effort on the other side. Not a maximum strike held back. Not a restrained force deliberately calibrated. An automatic response. Something closer to reflex than intention that had produced this result without requiring escalation. The distinction mattered. It meant the result was not a ceiling. It was a floor. He had understood things like this in the abstract before. He understood them differently now. His comms unit was active. Field coordinator requesting status. "Redirect rescue teams to the civilian shelters on Koshu Kaido," he said. "I want a fire line established along the northern evacuation corridor grid reference, 7 through 14. If the perimeter there holds the residential blocks, stay clear." A pause. "And tell the commission I'll need an updated operational map before evening. The one from this morning is already wrong." He walked out of the shop front. The street was still half evacuated. The commercial shutters still down the overhead sky, beginning to carry the particular pewter color of a city afternoon that has been running on adrenaline since before sunrise. 2 blocks north, Lobo was no longer visible. Hawks had watched the exchange from altitude. He had watched the flash-fire fist, watched the single return impact, watched Endeavor come out of the shop front and begin issuing field orders instead of pursuing. He filed 2 things simultaneously in the mental ledger he kept on all ongoing operations: that Endeavor had processed the information correctly, and that the information itself was worse than the morning's modeling had suggested. He banked east and opened a private channel to the Commission's intelligence desk. Not the coordination line, the other one, the one that had a different flag protocol and a shorter distribution list. "I need a sealed file started," he said. Everything we have on the deployment provision, the original contract language, the broker channel logs. The Clause 3 ping the payment trace. All of it. Single copy physical, not networked. That's outside standard documentation protocol, the desk analyst replied. Yes. Start it anyway. A pause on the line. Under whose authorization? Mine. Flag it for future review. You'll know when. He closed the channel and climbed higher, where the city spread below him in its damaged but still functioning grid, and thought about what he'd told his ground units that morning. Stop treating him like a villain. Treat him like a contractor. Contractors had deliverables. Deliverables required payment. Payment left a trail. The trail was the only thing in the situation that operated according to rules anyone here could use. He began composing the filing request, in his head precise and minimal, the way you compose anything you intend to use later. The darknet chatter started that evening. Not a single post, not a coordinated campaign. The kind of thing that emerges when enough people have the same idea at the same time and the same forum infrastructure to voice it fragmented, overlapping, self-amplifying. The core question was simple. If he works for whoever pays, what does it cost? The posts attached to it ranged from genuinely curious to deliberately provocative, to, in several cases, specific names of villain organizations. They'd like neutralized names of hero agencies. They'd like destabilized names. They didn't bother to explain. The Commission's monitoring unit flagged the original thread. 2 hours later, 17 derivative threads had joined it. By late night, the consolidated report reached the President's office with a single recommendation, bolded at the bottom of the summary. If the contracted operative becomes aware of this channel, we have no mechanism to prevent engagement. The President read the recommendation. She looked at her window. Tokyo at night agency logos, still cycling trains, still running the surface, still performing stability. She thought about what the broker had said on the phone that afternoon. Completion. She picked up a pen and wrote one line in the margin of the report and set it face down on her desk for the night. We can't control what he does. We can only control what we say about it. Outside, the city's night cycle continued without her permission or her knowledge, running on the accumulated momentum of everything that had happened since the small hours of the morning. In 48 hours, the Commission would be managing something that did not yet have a name. In 72, it would have too many. Somewhere in Nishi Shinjuku, a convenience store that had reopened after the cordon lifted was playing a news channel on its overhead screen. The anchor was delivering the Commission's 1,300 release with the careful vocal neutrality of someone reading a text they personally disbelieve. On the counter beside the register, a customer's phone screen showed the darknet thread open in a browser, zoomed into the center of the question, the cursor sitting still in the reply box. The customer stared at it for a long time. Then he put the phone face down and paid for his coffee and left. But the cursor was still there when he walked out, blinking in the empty reply field, patient as a clock. The thread had changed overnight. What had been a question, if he works for whoever pays, what does it cost, was now a structure. Someone with patience and a working knowledge of anonymous transaction infrastructure had converted the original post into a tiered board. At the top, a header in plain text. Open contract submit via drop channel payment confirms acceptance. Below it, a growing list of entries formatted with the clean economy of someone who had run procurement before target type. Asset relocation / enforcement / termination. Jurisdiction, domestic preferred cross-border. Negotiable proof required. Photo plus timestamp on completion, current offers. See attached thread. By the time the Commission's monitoring unit identified the board and flagged it for removal, it had been mirrored to 11 separate nodes. By the time removal requests reached the first 3 hosting services, 4 more mirrors had appeared. The board didn't need protection. It had redundancy. Hawks found it early that morning, 17 minutes after the monitoring flag arrived on his secondary device. He read through the structure once, then opened a separate document and began logging the payment routing tags visible in the submission headers. Most were layered through enough intermediate steps to be untraceable with standard investigative tools. 2 were not. Those 2 he marked separately in a notation that meant "follow later," and closed the document and filed it in the sealed folder that now had a physical copy sitting in a locked drawer in his agency office. He didn't move to shut the board down. Shutting it down would have been clean and fast, and completely useless for the same reason that pulling the broadcast the morning before had been useless. The information it contained had already moved. Tatent. The drop point was a locker in a transit station in Chuo Ward. No one saw Lobo place anything in it. The station's surveillance system experienced a 40-second gap in its recording before dawn that morning. Not a blackout, not an error flag, just a gap, the kind that appears when someone who understands sensor infrastructure passes through it. When the recording resumed, nothing was visibly different. The locker remained closed. By early morning, the first submission had come through the drop channel. By mid-morning, there were 14. The message Lobo had left in the channel was 4 words: pay first, then talk. The 3 people who paid first were not who the commission would have predicted. The first was a woman in her early 40s who lived in a residential district north of Musutafu. Her name was not on any registry of interest. She had no criminal record, no political affiliations, no documented connections to any villain network. What she had was a case number assigned 3 years ago to an incident in which a mid-level villain with a body multiplication quirk had destroyed her brother's business and left him with permanent nerve damage. The case had been processed. The villain had been sentenced. The sentence had been commuted 18 months later under a provision she'd been notified about by a form letter. She had filed 3 complaints with the Hero Licensing Board. She had received 3 acknowledgement receipts. She paid the equivalent of 8 months' salary through a layered transfer she'd spent 2 weeks figuring out how to make. She did not know what she was buying precisely. She knew what she wanted. The second was a corporate entity registered in a jurisdiction that handled registration with minimum documentation requirements. Its representative had the practiced anonymity of someone who moved money for a living and found the current opportunity operationally interesting. The entity had interests adjacent to 2 hero agencies currently ranked in the top 30. Destabilizing those agencies' public positioning would have measurable market effects. The math was clean. The payment came through structured channels and was 3 orders of magnitude larger than the first. The third was not a person. It was an organization, what remained of one, anyway, that operated in a space the hero ranking system had never adequately mapped. They had no grievance with the hero system in the principled sense. They had grievances with specific individuals currently detained and with the facilities holding them. And they had been watching the Darknet board since its first hour with the focused attention of people who recognize an opportunity when it materializes. Their payment was conditional. Their target was a facility. The Hero Agency on the 4th floor of a commercial building in Koto Ward received its first unusual call that morning. The caller did not threaten. The caller asked with genuine curiosity and a tone that suggested the question had been sitting with them for some time. If he works for whoever pays, why are you still here? The front desk operator had been briefed that morning, no engagement with press. No statements refer unusual inquiries to the commission liaison. She referred the call. The commission liaison received it, logged it, and forwarded it upward. Upward forwarded it to a committee that was already managing 49 other unusual inquiries from the past 18 hours, and the call joined the pile. By afternoon, 3 separate hero agencies had locked their public entrances. 2 had not locked them for security reasons. They had locked them because their staff were having difficulty entering, without encountering citizens who had opinions about the morning's news cycle and the means to express them at close range. The locks were a practical measure. They looked from the outside exactly like retreat. The Hero Billboard Chart's quarterly tracking system registered a 7-point average drop in public confidence scores across the top 15 ranked heroes. 7 points in a single day was outside every modeled scenario the chart's monitoring team had in their historical data set. The team lead sent a memo to her supervisor that afternoon, noting with professional understatement that the current data pattern did not resemble any prior crisis event in the system's 12-year operational history. The job that completed in the early afternoon was not on any official record. The target was a man who operated a document forgery network out of a storage facility in Edogawa Ward. He had been flagged by 3 separate hero agencies over the past 2 years, investigated twice, and never charged because the evidence each time had been insufficient for the prosecution threshold. He was not a violent criminal. He was a careful one, which in the current hero licensing environment had proven more durable. He was also, as of 48 hours prior, a completed submission on the board. At that same hour, a rescue team responding to an unrelated structural report in Edogawa Ward found the storage facility's door open, and the man sitting on the floor outside it with his hands folded on his knees, and an expression that could only be described as the face of someone who has been briefly and comprehensively informed of their situation. He was uninjured. He was cooperative. He was the first officer on scene noted in the incident report, unusually willing to provide documentation. The video of the moment, 37 seconds shot from a residential window across the street, circulated for 6 hours before the commission's digital response team could flag it. In those 6 hours, it was viewed 412,000 times. The comments were not uniform in sentiment, but they were uniform in one quality. Nobody who watched the video expressed surprise. They expressed recognition, as if what they were seeing confirmed something they had already been prepared to believe. This was, Hawks noted when he watched it that evening, considerably more dangerous than shock would have been. He isn't the weapon. He was standing in his agency's rooftop access point, looking south over the city. His wings held loosely at half extension in the way he held them when he was thinking rather than flying. His field coordinator was on the other end of the earpiece waiting. "He's the proof of concept," Hawks continued. "The market is the weapon." He just opened the door. "The commission is requesting all top-tier heroes attend a coordination briefing at 1800. I'll be there." He paused. "Tell them I have materials to share. Physical documentation. They should have a secure review protocol ready." He closed the channel and looked at the city for another moment. The agency logos on the billboard rotation 2 blocks east had been cycling normally all day, ranked faces, quarterly updates. The industry's self-image running on its standard timer, regardless of what the streets below were registering. He watched one full cycle. 6 heroes, 6 brands. 6 promises made to a public that was currently asking a different kind of professional for services. He opened the sealed folder's documentation index on his secured device and added 3 new entries: the payment routing tags, the Edogawa incident report, and a timestamp notation about the video's circulation window. The folder was getting heavy. That was, in a paradoxical way, the only good news of the day. Heavy folders were usable. Thin folders were just hope. And the commission's evening briefing lasted 40 minutes. The president spoke for 8 of them. The rest was field reports, social monitoring summaries, agency status updates, a legal review of jurisdictional options that concluded after 11 minutes of careful language that there were none currently available that had not been foreclosed by the deployment provisions liability structure. After the briefing, the president held back 3 people: the senior legal advisor, the intelligence desk lead, and Hawks. "We've been managing the narrative," she said. The word managing had a different weight than it had carried a week ago. "We need to start thinking about the structure. The board, the payments, the verification cycle. This is becoming infrastructure. Once it has infrastructure, it has inertia. It already has inertia. Not unkindly, just precisely." She looked at him. "What do you recommend?" "Not a public move. Not yet." He set a single sheet on the table, a printed summary, nothing networked, with 3 columns of information. Payment vectors, asset types, known correlating entities. "I recommend we identify the load-bearing points of the payment structure and build a case. A real case, the kind that can survive external review, not just internal documentation." The legal advisor looked at the sheet. "External review means disclosure." "Yes." A long pause. The intelligence desk lead looked at the president. The president looked at the sheet. "How long?" she asked. "Depends on how much access I get to the broker channel logs, and how much of the original contract paperwork the legal team is willing to put in front of me." Another pause. Longer. "I'll authorize the access," the president said finally. Not quickly, not happily, in the tone of someone making the least bad choice available. Hawks picked up the sheet. "Then give me 4 days." In a room in Sugamo that had been a community meeting space before the area's partial evacuation and was now being used as an informal coordination point by a villain-adjacent network with no official name and a very clear set of interests, 3 people sat around a folding table and reviewed the conditional payment confirmation on a screen. The facility they had specified in their submission was Tartarus. The first one's message was brief: "He took it." The second looked at the confirmation timestamp. "He took the payment." That's not the same thing. A third: "Payment confirms acceptance. That's what the board says." A silence. Tartarus has never been breached. Not a counter-argument, a fact being acknowledged before being set aside. Tartarus was built to hold the things this country produces. It was never designed for something that came from somewhere else. Outside, Tokyo's evening was settling into the particular quiet that follows a day of sustained unease. Not peace, but exhaustion, wearing peace's clothing. In the Commission's intelligence wing, a flag had just been raised on the conditional payment confirmation from Sugamo, 37 minutes too late to prevent the acceptance timestamp from processing. The president's note from the previous evening was still on her desk, face down. Tartarus had been built to hold monsters. It had never been tested against a contractor. The decision was made in the early hours of day 5, long before dawn, not in the Commission's operations room. In a smaller space, a conference annex, 3 floors above it, with 4 people instead of 12, and no recording equipment, which had become the standard condition for anything that mattered. The president, the senior legal advisor, the director of hero operations, a general from the self-defense forces who had been briefed 40 minutes prior and had not yet adjusted his expression to accommodate what he'd been told. The proposal on the table was not called an arrest. It was called a containment demonstration. The operations director laid out the logic. Tartarus has held the most dangerous individuals this country has ever produced. No Mu-class threats. Villain leadership. Assets that cannot be processed through conventional detention. If the public sees him placed there, even temporarily, it re-establishes the narrative. that the state retains functional authority. "And if Tartarus can't hold him?" the general asked. A silence of the kind that means the question has already been answered privately, and no one wants to say it aloud in a room with a recording prohibition. "Then nothing can. And we need to know that now, before the board generates another 300 submissions and the hero system loses another 12 legitimacy points." The president looked at the table. She looked at the table. "Prepare the transfer operation. I want it designated as routine facility security protocol, not a capture or relocation. If he comes voluntarily, better. If not..." She paused. "We document what happens and use the documentation." The general looked at her. "Use it for what?" "To show the world we tried." Tartarus rose from the water 12 kilometers offshore. It had been positioned there, deliberately, distance from civilian population, a single access corridor by water and air. No land approach that couldn't be monitored and sealed within minutes. The complex had been designed by engineers who had spent 2 years studying every documented villain capability in the National Registry and building responses into the architecture itself. Anti-flight barriers, EMF suppression across quirk-active frequencies, pressure locks, sonar a cell block system where each unit was sealed independently, so that a rupture in one section could not cascade to another. The warden had never needed to use the cascade procedure. In 11 years of operation, Tartarus had not experienced a breach. This was cited regularly in official communications as proof of the installation's design integrity. It was Hawks reflected as the transport helicopter crossed the 12-kilometer stretch of open water, also proof of its untested limits. He was not there to fight. Neither was Endeavor sitting across from him in the transport, with his arms crossed and his eyes forward, and the particular stillness of someone who has decided in advance what they will and will not do. The commission had designated them as the Field Coordination Presence, meaning they would manage evacuation of non-essential personnel, maintain the air corridor, and ensure civilian distancing from the operations perimeter. The actual transfer team was SDF. F led 32 personnel equipped with every category of restraint technology the Joint Hero Military Development Program had produced in the past decade. Hawks looked at the facility growing in the transport window and thought the restraint technology had been designed for things that came from here. Things that were products of this country's biology, this country's history, this country's particular mutation of human potential. It had not been designed for something that came from somewhere else entirely. He didn't say this. He filed it. Lobo arrived at Tartarus shortly after 6 in the morning, traveling across open water in a way the sonar array logged as an impact sequence rather than an approach, as if the ocean were a surface to be crossed rather than an obstacle to be navigated, which for him it was. The outer perimeter alert activated almost immediately. The cascade response armed within moments. The transfer team was in position. The warden had been briefed. The SDF commander had authorized a maximum restraint response if the subject resisted intake processing. The subject did not reach intake processing. The outer blast door, reinforced steel core ceramic composite facing hydraulic seal, rated to withstand a NOMU-class direct strike, lasted 4 seconds. Not because 4 seconds was its limit, because 4 seconds was how long it took Lobo to reach it. After crossing the outer perimeter, and what followed was not an attack so much as a reclassification. The door had been a barrier, and then it wasn't. The hydraulic seal vented. The ceramic composited distributed its failure in a pattern that the structural analysis team would later describe in careful language as inconsistent with any documented force application event in the facility's incident history. The cascade response triggered. Section by section, the interlocks engaged. The suppression fields activated. The restraint teams fell back to secondary positions. None of it mattered in the way it was supposed to matter. The suppression fields operated on quirk frequencies, specifically the biological electromagnetic signatures associated with the known range of quirk expression. Lobo's biology did not produce those signatures. The fields washed over him and registered nothing to suppress because there was nothing in their vocabulary that corresponded to what he was. The pressure locks slowed him for approximately 3 seconds. The sonar array tracked his position with precision and sent that position to systems that were already too far behind the event to use it. The inner block was breached less than 10 minutes after he arrived. The warden's emergency channel came alive shortly after with a single transmission from a guard on sublevel 3. "He's not stopping. He's not even looking at us. He's going somewhere." He was. The conditional submission from Sugamo had specified a cell block. The acceptance timestamp had confirmed. He had a delivery address, the same as any other job. He reached it. He completed it. Extraction of the specified asset proof of completion logged through the drop channel shortly afterward, and he walked back out through the path he had entered by through the sections of now unsecured corridor and the emergency lighting and the suppression fields still broadcasting their irrelevant signals into empty air. The isolation architecture designed to contain a rupture in one section had not anticipated failure across all sections simultaneously. When the primary locks gave way, the secondary measures engaged. When those failed, the tertiary redundancies activated. Each failure took slightly longer than the engineers had modeled, because the engineers had modeled sequential failures. This was not sequential. Within the half hour, the response tree had exhausted itself, and the cells began opening on emergency default, the failsafe, that in the event of total system failure releases internal pressure to prevent structural collapse. The prisoners came out on their own. Lobo was already gone. Hawks watched it from the air. He had been hovering at the evacuation perimeter when the first alert came through, and he had made the decision that the transfer team and the SADF personnel needed to get off the facility before the default cascade completed. He had spent the next 19 minutes doing exactly that. Directing the air corridor, calling in Coast Guard support, managing the water surface evacuation with the same professional economy he used for everything. Because professionalism was the only thing currently available that had any effect. Endeavor had taken the water side. Fire line along the access corridor, cutting off the primary escape vector from the outer structure, directing his flash fire fist not at any individual target, but at the water surface to create a thermal barrier, not elegant, not strategic, but physically effective at slowing the outflow while the evacuation completed. Neither of them said much. The earpiece traffic was operational positions, head counts, transport requests, and there was no room in it for the other kind of language. Before 8 in the morning, the last SDF transport cleared the structure. 8 minutes later, the Coast Guard perimeter sealed. Shortly after Hawks filed his field report, added 6 new entries to the physical folder, and looked at Tartarus from altitude. Half its outer section compromised emergency lighting, still cycling in the areas with active power. The ocean around it interrupted by the debris field that had been its front approach. His earpiece was closed. He was talking to himself or to the folder. "This isn't a prison problem." The words landed in empty air. "It's a legitimacy problem." Endeavor was on the Coast Guard platform below, standing at the rail looking at the facility. He had not filed his field report. He had not, as far as Hawks could see, moved in several minutes. Hawks didn't call down to him. He understood the particular stillness. He had felt it himself in smaller ways across the past 5 days. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating what they thought the ground was made of. Tug. The first news alert reached the mainland before 8 in the morning. The government's national emergency declaration followed shortly after the first. Since the crisis peak 18 months prior, the one that had stretched the hero system to the breaking point that had in some accounting led to the Commission's current situation. 3 regional governments issued supplementary advisories within the hour. Before noon, the self-defense forces were active in 7 prefectures, and 3 foreign governments had issued travel advisories for Japan. A 4th suspended a bilateral security consultation meeting scheduled for the following week. The Hero dispatch system, already running at fractured capacity after 5 days of the board's operation, was now receiving simultaneous requests from 12 separate crisis points. The coordination desk processed them the way a drain processes a flood, technically functional, visibly overwhelmed. Citizens in districts adjacent to known villain territories did what people do when the system meant to protect them. Demonstrates a visible limit. Some stayed inside. Some organized. A few made decisions they would not have made the day before when the limit had not yet been demonstrated publicly at scale with footage. The diplomatic language was careful and formal, and set in the register of international relations exactly what the woman in Sugamo had said in plain speech 5 days prior. Something has changed here, and we do not know its shape yet. The Commission received these advisories and logged them, and did not for the first time in the week's operation issue a public response. There was no response available that would not make the position worse. This was a new condition. It had not existed before the breach that morning. Atua Izuku Midoriya heard the emergency alert at 8 in the morning and read the scroll text twice. He was in the dormitory common room early, having slept poorly. The alert was on the communal screen, the kind of scroll that appeared in red at the top of every broadcast channel simultaneously. The kind that the system reserved for events it classified as requiring immediate national attention. He had seen the classification before. He had seen it 3 times in his hero training, each time attached to events that had redefined something he thought was fixed. He read the scroll. He looked at the name of the facility. He thought about the conversation at UA 2 days ago, where his homeroom teacher had briefed them in careful language about the ongoing operational situation and asked them to remain on campus and trust the system. He was not angry at the system. He understood the system. He had studied it, trained within it, believed in its capacity to hold not perfectly, but enough. He looked at the scrolled text and thought the thing that came here did not come for the system. It came for a contract, and the contract did not care what the system believed about itself. His notebook was on the table beside him, the current volume half filled with observations from the past 5 days. He hadn't written anything in it today. He picked up his pen. He wrote 1 line, then stopped and looked at it. He isn't fighting us. He's working. There's a difference. He put the pen down. Outside the sky over Musutafu was the flat gray of a day that hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. He stayed at the table for a long time, thinking. Lobo sat on what remained of the outer wall's upper edge, a section of the blast structure that had held by structural coincidence in a configuration that produced something approximately like a ledge, and looked at the ocean. He had a cigar. He had retrieved it from a storage compartment in the Space Hog, which he had left in a parking structure in Chuo War, and which had remained there undisturbed because the one officer who had tried to move it had reconsidered after touching the handlebars. He lit it. He looked at the water. The job was done. The payment would route. The next contract submission in the drop channel was from a corporate entity with a specific brief that he had read and found straightforward. There were also 4 submissions he had declined without response, because their specifications fell outside the parameters he bothered with. Not ethics, not preference, just the professional calculation of what constituted an interesting enough problem to be worth his time. He smoked. The ocean moved. The emergency lighting on the sections below him cycled steadily, red and white, the facility's autonomic system still running their protocols in the absence of the people those protocols had been designed to serve. He did not think about what he had broken. He thought about what was next on the list. That was in its way the most frightening thing of all. Not the damage, but the complete absence of its weight. The rescue work had a sound, not the sound of the crisis itself. That had been sirens and alarms, and the low structural groan of Tartarus, losing its integrity across 12 kilometers of open water. This was the sound, after radio calls in short bursts, the scrape of debris being moved by hand, the specific cadence of a medic counting compressions, a child asking a question nobody answered because everyone near her was occupied. Emergency lighting threw everything in alternating red and white. The coast had been receiving transport after transport since early morning. And the intake area looked like what it was, a system processing more than it had been built for, doing it anyway because the people running it had not stopped. Deku had been on the ground since shortly after the transports cleared. He had come not as a combat asset. The Commission's directive was still technically in effect, and besides, there was nothing here that needed fighting. But as an extra pair of hands, and hands were what the triage coordinator had needed for the past 2 hours. He had carried stretchers, helped establish a secondary intake point. When the first one backed up, talked a man in his 60s through a breathing exercise. When the man had decided the world was ending and needed someone to disagree with him calmly. The work was the kind that didn't look like hero work in any branding sense. But it was the kind that kept people alive, while the system around them tried to reconstitute itself. 2 hours into the morning, he was helping reposition a portable barrier near the northern triage point when he looked up and saw Lobo. Not at distance, not through binoculars or on a screen. Sitting on a section of collapsed outer wall that had washed ashore during the night and settled into a stable configuration at the edge of the cleared perimeter, close enough that Deku could see the cigar. The space hog, which Deku had read about in a note Hawks had circulated about the asset's known equipment, was nowhere visible. Lobo was sitting the way people sit when they have nothing pressing to attend to, and no particular feeling about that fact, one arm on a raised section of debris, looking at the water smoke rising in a slow vertical line in the still morning air. He did not look like someone who had just broken a facility that had held for 11 years. He looked like someone waiting for a bus. Hawks was 30 meters away on the roof of a Coast Guard receiving station. When he saw Deku change direction, he knew immediately what was happening. He had watched Deku work for 2 hours the specific way the kid moved through a crisis, always toward the sharpest point of need, always reading the room before acting, never showing off because showing off required an audience, and he'd already decided the audience wasn't the point. Hawks understood that quality. He had it himself in different measure under different circumstances. He also knew that what Deku was walking toward had knocked Endeavor through a wall yesterday without raising its pulse rate. He dropped off the roof edge and caught an air current wings, angling for intercept. Midoriya. Deku looked up. 2 minutes. It was not a request framed as a request. It was a statement of what he was going to do, offered as information rather than negotiation. Hawks held position for a moment. Fierce wings spreading wide, the feathers reading the air in their passive monitoring sweep, and looked at Lobo, who had not reacted to either of them yet, and then looked back at Deku. 2 minutes. Hawks held position a moment longer. Then you're back on intake. Deku nodded and kept walking. He stopped 3 meters away, close enough to be heard at normal volume. Far enough that it wasn't a challenge, that distance was deliberate, a calculation Lobo would have recognized if he'd been watching, which he wasn't. He was still looking at the water. What were you hired to do? Lobo turned his head. He studied Deku with the same cataloging expression he'd used on Endeavor, on the Hero Agency building, on every piece of infrastructure he'd assessed since arriving. But there was something slightly different in the duration. A fraction of a second longer. The way you fix on something that said an unexpected word. He took a slow pull from the cigar. He blew the smoke out sideways. Huh, not dismissive. Something closer to genuine acknowledgement, the sound a professional makes when a junior asks the right question for the first time. He set the cigar on a flat section of debris beside him. Contract calls it a destabilization event. The scope is a threat threshold, some number your system was going to cross where it couldn't fix itself anymore. My job is the thing that pushes it past that threshold. He paused. Or was. Depends on where we are in the deliverables. Deku processed this for a moment. The threat threshold is that a specific event, a specific person? No. Then what is it? Lobo looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and not kind. The expression of someone deciding how much to invest in a conversation based on whether it's going to be interesting. It's the part of your system, he said, that makes the system possible, the stuff underneath. The belief that your ranked heroes are a real answer. The idea that a ranking chart means something. The agreement. He picked the cigar back up. Once that breaks past a certain point, it doesn't come back. The threshold is a measurement of how close you are to that point. I was hired to close the distance. Deku was quiet. Behind him, the receiving zone's radio crackled with a coordination call. 3 incoming, 2 critical requesting medic priority. Nobody stopped. The work continued. Who hired you? Deku asked. Your commission, which you probably knew. I mean, who gave them the contract? Lobo looked at him again. The assessment lasted longer this time. Someone who sells outcomes, not my department. And the target isn't a person. Target is a condition, Lobo said. Condition gets met, job's done, I get paid. The people in the way are just... He made a gesture with a hand holding the cigar. A small rolling motion, the universal sign for collateral arithmetic. In the way. Deku looked at the water for a moment, then at the processing area. A rescue hero, he recognized a third year from another school doing field internship hours. Was carrying a child on her back across the rubble field, one hand braced against a tilted wall for balance, moving fast and steady toward the medical tent. The child was holding the back of her hero costume with both hands. He watched that for 3 seconds. If the target is a condition, he said, what breaks the contract? What makes it void? Lobo was quiet for long enough that Deku thought the conversation was over. Then completion or non-payment, same as any job. Non-payment? Yeah, that's it. That's it. You want me to stop the payment. Everything else is noise. Deku turned that over. He had been thinking since reading the scroll that morning, since writing the line in his notebook, about what kind of problem this actually was. He had been trained. All of them had been trained to identify the threat, engage the threat, resolve the threat. The hero taxonomy ran on that structure. Even the most complex villain scenarios had eventually resolved into some version of it. This did not. This was a contract running on institutional infrastructure authorized by a body whose incentive was to cover the authorization funded through channels designed to resist tracing, executed by something that didn't need to be defeated in any conventional sense. Because it wasn't fighting, it was working. You couldn't resolve a job by punching the person doing it if the job continued to exist after the punch. You want a hero solution for a contract problem. He read the shape of the silence without contempt, just the flat diagnostic precision of someone identifying a category error. Doesn't exist. I know. That seemed to land differently than Lobo had expected. He studied Deku again. Deku was still watching the processing area. The rescue hero had reached the medical tent. The child had been handed off. The hero had already turned and was heading back out into the rubble. No pause. No acknowledgement. Just the effort continuing. You're not here to stop me. It wasn't a question. No. I was here to understand what I'm actually dealing with. A beat. And a condition. You just told me. He looked at Lobo directly. Conditions can be changed from the other end. Lobo said nothing. He smoked. He looked at the water. Something in his expression, not warmth, not respect exactly, but the small professional acknowledgement of one person, recognizing that another has correctly identified the shape of a problem, settled and held. He turned and walked back toward the medical line. 2 minutes, he said, and that was all. Hawks had watched the whole conversation from altitude. He had not intervened. He had tracked every word through his fierce wings, passive monitoring the ambient audio his feathers collected without looking like they were collecting, and filed it away in the same ledger he kept for everything. When Deku returned to the triage zone, Hawks dropped to the Coast Guard roof again and opened his secured device. The physical folder had gained 3 new entries this morning. He added a 4th annotation about the conversation's content. The specific phrase, non-payment voids the contract, and a timestamp. Then he opened the broker channel log, access the president had authorized the prior evening. He had 4 days. He started reading. On the debris ledge, Lobo watched the smoke from his cigar rise in a straight line and dissolve. The kid had asked the right question. More than that, he had heard the answer and immediately started thinking about what to do with it, not about what it meant about him or his system or his beliefs. Just information, received application, identified moving. Lobo had met a lot of people in a lot of systems across a lot of planets. And the rarest quality among all of them was the ability to let a bad answer be useful instead of devastating. He didn't alter his assessment of the job. The engagement remained. The scope remained. The deliverable condition was still being approached on schedule, but he noted it the way you note something that doesn't change anything and doesn't need to change anything and might still be the most interesting thing that happened on a given day. He picked up the cigar. He looked at the water. His device registered a ping from the drop channel new submission prepayment already deposited, target classification listed as infrastructure. He read the brief. He considered it for approximately 4 seconds. He stood up. Day 8 began without an alarm. The emergency broadcast system had been running on a 4-hour cycle since Tartarus, and by now the population had developed the particular urban adaptation to sustained crisis. The alert tone registered was processed and was set aside in the same movement. Not ignored, processed. Filed under still ongoing and moved past because the alternative was to stop. And that had stopped being an option around day 4. The lines at the evacuation centers had a different texture than the lines from the first 2 days. Earlier, people had been frightened in a way that moved quickly, loudly toward exits and officials and anyone in a hero costume. Now, they were frightened in a way that waited. Families sitting on floor space with their bags arranged around them, like a perimeter. Children asleep across parents' laps. Old men standing under the windows, looking at streets they'd lived on for 40 years, as if taking inventory. The questions at the registration desks had changed too. Day 1. Is it safe to go back day 3? When will this end? Day 8. Who authorized this? That last question had spread across every intake point in the greater Tokyo area by mid-morning. Not as a protest, not yet. As a genuine inquiry, the kind that emerges when people have had enough consecutive hours with nothing to do but think. The Hero Billboard Chart's digital display in Shibuya had been running a maintenance loop since the prior evening, which meant instead of cycling through the quarterly rankings, it was showing a static holding screen in commission blue. Someone had spray-painted 3 words across the lower half during the night. The letters were large enough to read from the opposite side of the intersection. Who authorized him? Before sunrise, the holding screen had been switched off entirely. The billboard went dark. It was the first time in 4 years the structure had not been displaying something. 3 hero agencies in the Kanto region suspended public operations before noon. Not closed, suspended, which meant the lights were still on and the staff were still inside. But the public-facing services that had been the visible proof of a functioning system were not available. Agency PR teams issued statements describing it as a temporary operational realignment. The statements used language that had been carefully constructed to avoid the word unsafe, while communicating exactly that condition. A sponsor, one of the large consumer electronics firms that had been the lead advertiser on the number 4 Heroes public profile for 3 years, quietly withdrew its contract. No announcement. Just a removal from the agency's website noticed by a fan account before anyone official acknowledged it, and from there it moved through open networks. At the speed of information that people want to confirm is real. The fan account's post read, "The billboard went dark this morning. The sponsor just vanished." Is this what it looks like from the outside when a system decides it's not responsible anymore? It was shared 80,000 times before lunch. Lobo stood outside the Commission's secondary coordination office in Shinjuku around midday and did nothing. He was simply there, leaning against the exterior wall of the building opposite, arms crossed, watching the entrance. No threat made. No word said. The staff inside the coordination office could see him through the lobby windows. He remained for 40 minutes. He did not move when a police unit established a perimeter at the street's end. He did not react when 2 hero-adjacent security contractors positioned themselves on the building's roof. He looked at the lobby windows with the patient, attentive focus of a man watching something he finds professionally interesting. 40 minutes later, the coordination office called the Commission's emergency line and reported that staff were unable to perform their duties in the current conditions. The Commission authorized a temporary relocation to a secondary site. It took 3 hours to arrange the move. During those 3 hours, 11 coordination functions that routed through that office experienced significant delays. Lobo left 1 minute after the call was made. 1 minute after the call was made. He had not touched anything. He had not spoken to anyone. He had stood outside a building for 40 minutes, and the building had stopped functioning. The 3 fractures were visible by afternoon. The first ran through the residential districts adjacent to the areas where villain activity had historically been concentrated. Groups of 3 to 7 people, some in civilian clothes, some in modified versions of unlicensed hero gear they'd been collecting or making for years, had established informal checkpoints on the main access roads. They were not violent. They were not organized in any official sense. They stopped. Vehicles asked questions, sometimes turned people back. When a licensed hero rescue team tried to pass through the Musashino checkpoint that afternoon, the team lead spent 20 minutes in a conversation that was not technically a confrontation and ended with the rescue team taking a 3-kilometer detour. The second fracture ran through money. In a 4-hour window between 1000 and 1407 private security firms in the greater Tokyo area reported a combined total of 917 new contract inquiries. Most were from residential addresses. Several were from business entities. 3 were from a single source that the firms independently and without coordination declined to identify. The firms that had the capacity to respond to the volume were doing so. The ones that didn't were putting people on wait lists. In the neighborhoods that couldn't afford private security firms, people had stopped calling hero agencies. Not because the agencies weren't answering, but because the agency's response times had degraded to the point where the call felt like an exercise in recording what had already happened. The third fracture was the one that moved fastest and made the least noise. It was not a protest. It was not an organized anything. It was a distributed consensus riving in individual conversations across the cities simultaneously about who had known what and when. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was manufactured from the accurate parts and the frightened parts and the angry parts, which is how most things that circulate in crisis conditions are made. Names of heroes who had been at official briefings. Screenshots of the Commission's original statement with the words "Special Ally" circled in red. The memo that had been leaked, a fragment of the Contain and Reframe directive, 6 lines of it missing context, but legible, which had appeared on open networks in the morning, and by early afternoon had been viewed by 3 million people, and had generated enough secondary commentary to fill a very long document with a very unhelpful signal-to-noise ratio. The name of the legal advisor who had left the Commission building before sunrise carrying a physical folder was not public, but the fact that someone had left was by late afternoon an established piece of the story. Endeavor held the northeastern evacuation corridor for the better part of the day without relief. He held it not because it was strategically critical. It wasn't in any military sense. But because it was the route that the Narima District Hospital used to receive patients from the affected residential blocks. And if the corridor closed, the hospital's intake capacity would halve within 6 hours. He stood at the northern checkpoint and directed traffic and managed 3 separate confrontations with groups who wanted to push through without clearance. 2 situations where people on stretchers needed to be moved quickly through crowds that were not in the mood to make space. He was pelted with something from a second-floor window mid-afternoon. Not heavy, a plastic bottle, mostly empty. It hit his shoulder and fell to the street. He did not look up. He continued directing the transport that was currently trying to navigate the intersection. A young hero field internship, hero name not yet assigned. Still technically a student, was working the south checkpoint when a man in his 40s started shouting at her. Not threats, accusations. She had known. They had all known. This was planned. The man had footage on his phone of the original briefing, paused on a frame that showed the Commission spokesperson's expression at the moment. Lobo said, "I work for whoever pays." And the man's argument was that the expression proved foreknowledge, and the expression did look like something, and the young hero stood there and listened to every word. Then, quietly, "I understand why you're angry. Please let me help you find the right place to register your family." The man stopped shouting. He didn't apologize. But he followed her to the registration desk. Hawks watched this from 300 meters up and wrote nothing in his ledger. Some things didn't need notation. They just needed to have happened. Deku was in Musutafu by early afternoon. Not because it was his assigned zone technically, he was still operating under UA's field guidance, which recommended campus-adjacent response only. He was there because the information he'd been receiving all day through his hero network indicated that the informal checkpoints in the residential areas were creating dead zones. Rescue teams couldn't reach them, and the people inside them were starting to make decisions based on the assumption that no one was coming. He went in without a uniform announcement, just his hero costume and his notebook and the specific quality of attention that made people feel in his vicinity like the situation was being taken seriously rather than managed. He spent 4 hours in 3 different neighborhoods. He helped to move a family whose first-floor apartment had been damaged in a structural aftershock. Nobody had reported because everyone had assumed someone else already had. He mediated a standoff between a checkpoint group and a rescue team that had escalated past shouting. He sat on a curb for 20 minutes with an elderly woman who had lived in her apartment building for 31 years and needed someone to explain to her without political language or PR, framing what had happened and why. He couldn't explain the why fully. He didn't pretend he could. He told her what he knew, that decisions had been made by people who thought they were choosing the least dangerous option. And the option had turned out to be very dangerous. And the people who had made it were now in a position where admitting it was harder than it should have been. The woman looked at him for a long moment. The woman looked at him for a long moment. That's not a hero answer. No, it's a true one. She let him help her move her plants to the second floor away from the window that the aftershock had cracked. That evening, Hawk sent a message to the president's secured line. It contained 4 words. The folder is ready. The broker channel logs had taken 3 days to parse. The payment routing had taken another half day after that. What he had assembled was not a criminal case. In the conventional sense, jurisdiction was complicated. The deployment provision had been constructed specifically to resist conventional legal frameworks, and several of the key links in the payment chain ran through entities that operated in gaps between national regulatory systems. But it was a case. In another sense, a documented sequence of decisions, authorizations, transfers, and outcomes that presented to the right audience in the right format would be impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. The question was the audience. Not a domestic court, not the commission itself. The right audience was the set of entities that had the authority and the incentive to freeze the payment infrastructure the deployment provision relied on, which meant international bodies, foreign financial regulators, and most importantly, the governments that had already issued travel advisories and suspended bilateral meetings and were currently watching Japan from a careful distance and deciding whether what they were seeing was a temporary crisis or a permanent reclassification. He would need all might for that. Not for the legal argument. For the weight, the kind of weight that made people in rooms pick up phones instead of waiting for reports. The kind of weight that was increasingly the only remaining resource in this situation that couldn't be purchased, replicated, or contractually voided. He sent a second message. Shorter. I need an hour. Tonight. In a conference room in Shinjuku that had been a working office 48 hours ago and now served as the Commission's improvised secondary operations center, the president read Hawk's message and set down her phone. Outside, the city's night cycle was beginning not the normal transition, but the version of it that existed now, where the agency billboards were mostly dark, and the streets that had been lively after midnight for years were quiet, and the police coordination channels that fed into the room's monitoring desk were running at triple their normal traffic volume. She thought about what she had written 8 days ago in the margin of a monitoring report in a room that still had all its furniture. We can't control what he does. We can only control what we say about it. She looked at the monitoring desk, at the feeds from 16 different districts, at the numbers she had been reading for 8 days that had only moved in one direction. She picked up her phone and replied to Hawk's authorized. Use whatever you need. Then she looked at the window for a long time at the dark billboard frames and the quiet streets, and the city that was still there, still running, still holding itself together by the accumulated force of people who hadn't stopped and thought about the gap between the city that existed and the story she had been trying to tell about it. The gap was no longer manageable. She had known that since the breach yesterday morning. She was only now saying it to herself in plain language. Lobo was in Koto Ward late that night, standing at the edge of a pier that extended into the water, looking south in the direction that Tartarus was or had been before the structural reporting that morning described its outer sections as partially collapsed and non-operational. He had a second cigar. He had been working steadily for 8 days, which for him was not remarkable. He had worked longer stretches under worse conditions, on worse planets for worse pay. But this job had a quality the others hadn't. The target was invisible. You couldn't point at a condition. You could only watch the meter. He looked at the city behind him. The dark billboards. The lit windows of the evacuation centers. The hero agencies with their lights on and their public hours suspended. You built a brand. He addressed the city in general, the people in it who had built something they believed in and watched it become something else. No malice in the words. Just description. I just canceled it. He finished the cigar. His device showed 3 new submissions in the drop channel. 2 were straightforward. 1 was not. The non-straightforward one had a target classification he hadn't seen in any prior submission coordination infrastructure national scale. He read the brief. He read the payment confirmation. He considered the scope. This was the one that would end it, the job that would take the system's connective tissue, the relay points and dispatch networks and communication hubs that kept emergency response from becoming 18 separate emergencies with no common address. If those went down, what remained of the hero system's ability to function as a system rather than a collection of individuals would go with them. He confirmed acceptance. He did not think about what came after. That was someone else's problem. His problem had a scope and a deadline and a payment structure, and all 3 were in order. He turned away from the water and walked back into the city. The dispatch map lost its first node in the deep middle of the night. Not dramatically, not with an alarm or a cascade alert. One circle on the grid, the relay point that handled emergency routing for the northeastern residential blocks, simply went gray. The duty operator noted it, flagged it for technical review, and moved on, because there were 41 other active flags requiring attention, and one gray circle in the northeast was not in isolation, a crisis. Less than an hour later, there were 4 gray circles. By early morning 11, the duty operator sent an escalation immediately after. The escalation reached the secondary operations center, the one in Shinjuku that had become the commission's de facto headquarters since the primary building had been under external observation, and was read by 2 people simultaneously, the night shift coordinator and the president, who had not slept. The coordinator's voice was flat, not an alert. A description. We're losing the ability to assign help. The president looked at the grid. Gray circles expanding outward from 3 separate origin points, not one source 3, which meant this was not a single target and a single action. It was a route. Someone had mapped the relay architecture and was moving through it. Get Endeavor's team to the medical corridor. If the hospital routes go gray, we lose triage capacity in 6 wards simultaneously. Everything else is secondary. She did not say Lobo's name. She did not need to betat Semura Chabwa. Lobo had started before the map registered its first loss. The first relay point was a nondescript building in Kota Ward, 3 stories municipal infrastructure, the kind of structure that exists in the background of a city's operation and is noticed only when it stops. He had spent 11 minutes inside. When he left, the building's systems were running on backup power. The primary routing hardware had been physically separated from its network connections in a way that no remote override could reverse, and the backup power had approximately 4 hours before it cycled down. The second point in Adachi Ward took 8 minutes. The third in Narima 6. He was not moving fast because he was in a hurry. He was moving at the pace of someone who has done this kind of work before and knows that the difference between 6 minutes and 10 minutes is not efficiency. It is the gap between getting out before the response units arrive and having an unnecessary conversation. He had no interest in conversations tonight. He had a brief to complete. At each location, the action was the same. Enter, locate the load-bearing component of the relay architecture, separate it from its redundancies, leave. No fire, no explosion, no structural damage that would make the news on its own terms. Just infrastructure that no longer functioned in a way that would take days of engineering work to reverse, in a city that did not currently have the days. Within the next 2 hours, the dispatch map had 23 gray circles. Shortly after the emergency response coordination system, the software layer that translated incoming calls into routed assignments across all licensed hero agencies, registered a processing error, and fell back to manual override mode. Manual override mode had been designed as a temporary failsafe for single-node failures. It had not been designed for 23. The duty operator at the main dispatch center switched to manual and looked at the incoming queue and understood in the specific way that people who run operational systems understand things, that what was about to happen to the next 8 hours was not going to be manageable with the current staffing. She called in every off-shift operator she had a number for. Endeavor held the medical corridor. He had been in position since before the gray circles began. Before the gray circles because Hawks had briefed him the prior evening, and he had decided that whatever happened overnight, the hospital route was not going to be one of the things that failed. He stood at the northern junction with 3 rescue team members and managed traffic with the patient grim competence of someone who has decided that this is the job tonight and the job will be done. Around mid-morning, a vehicle convoy carrying 12 people from an affected residential block came through the junction. Moving fast, the driver visibly panicked, running lights. Endeavor stepped into the road. The convoy stopped. He walked to the driver's window and spoke for 30 seconds. Not calmly, not gently, but with the specific authority of someone whose authority is currently the only functional authority in this junction. And the driver slowed down and followed the marked route to the hospital entrance. An hour later, a man on foot arrived at the junction carrying his wife, who had gone into labor sometime in the preceding 2 hours. Endeavor called the hospital for a direct receive, got no answer. Called the backup line, got a delayed response. And in the gap between calls, picked the woman up himself and carried her the 400 meters to the hospital entrance at a pace that the 3 rescue team members had to run to match. The woman delivered 45 minutes later. The medical staff on duty were working at capacity. They managed. Hawks was monitoring from the air. He noted the time, the outcome, and filed nothing in the ledger, same as the previous evening. Some things were already in the record, by virtue of having occurred. The sealed folder had been in Hawks's agency office since day 5. He retrieved it in the pre-dawn hours when the gray circles were multiplying, and the dispatch system was still holding on manual, and the window for doing this in a way that would matter was narrowing with every hour. He sat at his desk and opened it and spent 30 minutes going through the contents in order the payment routing tags, the Clause 3 ping, the broker channel log. Excerpts the Tartarus incident timeline. The 3 fragments of the contain and reframe directive that had leaked publicly, and most importantly, the original deployment provision text. All 12 pages, with the underlined clause on page 9 and the activation timestamp in the footer. The case was not perfect. It would not survive a conventional criminal proceeding under Japanese law, because the deployment provision had been specifically written to operate outside Japanese law, which was itself a kind of evidence, but required a particular interpretive framework to be useful. What it would survive, what it had been built to survive, was the scrutiny of the kind of people who made decisions about financial infrastructure. Bankers and regulators and the officials who administered the mechanisms through which international payment guarantees moved. Those people didn't need criminal certainty. They needed enough documented irregularity to justify a hold. He had enough. He put the folder in a bag and went to find All Might. All Might was at UA. Not in his office. He was in the common area of the dormitory block where the first-year students were housed, sitting at a table with 2 cups of tea, one for himself and one that had been placed across from him in case anyone needed it, which had been his practice every morning for the past 3 years. The students were awake, all of them, when he arrived, because the alerts had been running for hours, and sleeping through a national emergency was not something their training had made easy. He was not giving a speech. He was not performing anything. He was sitting at the table drinking tea in the specific way that someone whose entire professional life has been built around the idea that presence is reassurance. Understands how to be present. Hawks arrived before first light, still carrying the bag. He sat down across from All Might and put the folder on the table between them. Hawks put the folder on the table between them. "I need you to make a call." All Might looked at the folder. "Tell me what you have." Hawks told him. It took 12 minutes. All Might listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that never changed, regardless of the circumstances. The quality of attention he brought to information he hadn't asked for, as if every piece of it deserved to be taken seriously until proven otherwise. When Hawks finished, All Might looked at the folder on the table. "The people you're sending this to, they'll act on it. They'll act on it faster if they believe it's real. Your name on the transmission makes it real in a way that the documentation alone doesn't." All Might was quiet for a moment. Outside, the dawn was beginning, the sky lightening in the direction of the bay, over the water where Tartarus had been. All Might's question was quiet. "You're not asking me to fight." "No. I'm asking you to stand in a room and say this happened and it matters, and the people who can do something about it need to do it now." A pause, which is what you've always done, just in a different room. All Might looked at the folder for another moment. Then he picked up his phone. "Who first?" he asked. Now, the packet went out with the morning. Not through a single channel, through 7 simultaneously, each carrying the same contents formatted for a different recipient context. Financial regulatory bodies in 3 jurisdictions, 2 international security coordination offices, the liaison desks of the 4 governments that had issued travel advisories, and 1 recipient that Hawks had not listed in any prior documentation, the broker's own payment clearinghouse, which he had identified through 6 steps of routing analysis, and which received a copy of the deployment provision, including the clause that specified payment obligations, along with a documented record of what those obligations had produced. Not a legal threat. A notification. The notification said, in effect, "The people who contracted with you have authorized actions that have generated documented international liability. The payment infrastructure supporting this engagement is now subject to review by the entities listed in the attached correspondence. We recommend you be aware of this before the next scheduled transfer." Hawks did not know if the broker would respond to that. He did not know if the broker read its own clearinghouse notifications, or whether the broker was even a single entity that could read anything. But the clearinghouse was a real mechanism, and the review was a real process, and real mechanisms responded to real processes in predictable ways, regardless of who owned them. He sent the packet and leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of All Might's spare office, where they had set up the transmission equipment, and thought, "Now we wait and see if the world moves faster than the damage does." The international responses began arriving within 2 hours. Not dramatic responses, not declarations or emergency sessions, or anything that would make a headline, in the way the past 8 days had made headlines. The kind of responses that happen in the background of international affairs and look from the outside like nothing a scheduled transfer put on hold pending clarification. A guarantee instrument flagged for secondary review. A correspondence request forwarded to a government ministry that would need to provide documentation within a specified window. Each of these things individually was a delay. Together, they were the beginning of the only kind of pressure that the deployment provision had not been written to withstand, the kind that operated through the same financial and administrative infrastructure the provision relied on to function. The Commission received 3 formal diplomatic inquiries before noon. It issued no response to any of them. It had no response prepared because it had not modeled this as a possible attack vector. The provision had been designed to avoid domestic legal frameworks. It had not been designed to avoid the attention of the entities that maintained the global payment systems its guarantee structure depended on. That gap had been Hawks's bet. It was so far paying. Lobo was aware that something had changed by early afternoon. Not through any surveillance or network access he didn't bother with either. Through the simpler mechanism of professional experience, when you've done this long enough, you develop a sense for when a job's financial structure is being looked at. It's a pressure very faint, the kind that arrives before anything formal has happened. The way a change in barometric reading arrives before the weather does. He was standing on the roof of a building in Sumida Ward when he felt it. He looked at his device. The drop channel was still active. The current payment tranches were still routing. He had checked at midday and everything was processing normally. But there was a lag in the clearinghouse confirmation that hadn't been there this morning. 3 minutes instead of 40 seconds. He noted it. He filed it in the same place. He filed everything the working ledger of a professional assessing his operational environment. He looked out at the city below with the tone of someone who has been waiting for the other party to figure out the right question. Now we're talking. He looked at the dispatch map on the public emergency system, the one the city ran for civilian use, not the commission's internal grid. It was showing 17 dead zones now. The ones he'd created were holding. The system was compensating around them, the way a river compensates around obstacles, finding new paths moving slower, losing pressure. Below in the street, a hero he didn't recognize was helping an elderly man carry boxes from a ground-floor apartment that had been flagged for structural risk. The hero was in costume. The hero was based on the framing clearly exhausted. The hero was doing it anyway. Lobo watched for approximately 5 seconds. He had no opinion about it. It was not his department. He turned and walked to the rooftop access door. That afternoon, Deku was in a school gymnasium in Musutafu that had been converted to a community shelter 14 hours ago and was now functioning as the closest thing the district had to a stable center of operations. He had been there since 1100. In that time, he had helped set up a supply distribution system, mediated 2 confrontations between groups with conflicting claims on sleeping space, organized a rotating watch schedule with 3 pro heroes who were also sheltering there while off duty, and spent 40 minutes explaining the emergency alert system to a room of 30 people who had not understood it and had therefore been more frightened by it than they needed to be. It was not heroic work in any of the ways he'd been trained to perform heroism. It was the other kind, the kind that didn't generate footage, didn't have a clean narrative arc, didn't end with a clear win. It just ended with the day being slightly more manageable than it would have been otherwise, which was the only kind of win currently on offer. His phone showed a notification from the Emergency Coordination Network, regional dispatch capacity 34%. Estimated restoration timeline unknown. He looked at it. 34%. That meant 66% of the people in this city who needed directed emergency help tonight were going to be relying on whatever informal structure existed between them and the people around them. He looked at the room, the shelter, the distribution lines and the sleeping areas and the watch schedule on the whiteboard, and the people running all of it, not heroes mostly. Just people who had decided that what was in front of them needed handling and they were going to handle it. He thought about what Lobo had said 7 days ago. A condition. Target is a condition. He thought conditions can be changed from either end. Conditions can be changed from this end too. Slowly. Without a clear win. Without a clean arc. He erased estimated restoration timeline unknown from his mental priority list and went back to work. Hawk sent the final status update that night. To the president, to the legal team, and to All Might. 3 lines, no preamble. International review active across 6 jurisdictions. Payment hold initiated on primary guarantee instrument. Estimated propagation to secondary instruments 12 to 18 hours. Then a fourth line added after a pause. "We're not done, but the door's open." The president read it in the operations center, surrounded by the feeds from 20 districts and the sound of the manual dispatch operators working through their queues and the low hum of a city that was damaged and still present. She forwarded it to the legal team with one annotation. "Prepare the disclosure package. Full scope. Tonight." Outside, the dark billboard frames were still dark. But 3 of the evacuation centers had reported voluntary civilian participation in their logistics operations, people who hadn't been directed there, who had simply shown up and asked what needed doing. The door was open. What came through it was still undetermined. The first freeze notice arrived before 9 in the morning. Not a dramatic declaration. Not a press announcement. A single administrative communication from a financial regulatory body in a jurisdiction that had received the international packet 20 hours prior, addressed to the clearinghouse, through which the deployment provision's primary guarantee rooted. The communication was 3 paragraphs. Its language was formal and bloodless. It said in effect that the holding structure in question was subject to a temporary suspension pending verification of the authorizing party's jurisdictional standing and scope of authority. 3 paragraphs. Sent to a clearinghouse address. And for 20 minutes, nothing visibly changed. Then the secondary financial mechanism flagged. Then the tertiary. Then the payment routing chain that connected the clearinghouse to the broker's operational accounts, a chain that had been running without interruption for 11 days, registered its first processing delay. Hawks was in the secondary operations center when the legal team's alert came through. He read it once, put the phone on the table, and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds. "It's moving." The president looked at the notification on her own screen. "How long until the primary instrument is fully suspended?" 6 to 12 hours. Depends on how many jurisdictions file simultaneously. He picked the phone back up. 2 more filed in the last 40 minutes. They're moving together, one files, the others follow. That's what international momentum looks like when it actually builds. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning shift was coming in the operators who would spend the next 8 hours managing the manual dispatch system, which was running at 41% capacity and had been improving slowly as the engineering teams worked through the damaged relay points one by one. Slowly, but moving. The president looked at the notification. "What does Lobo do when the payment stops?" "He stops. That's the contract." "You're certain?" He thought about the conversation he had not been party to, the one Daegu had reported back in 2 sentences the prior week, sitting on a Coast Guard station step with his notebook, and the particular expression of someone who has received information and immediately begun converting it into use. Non-payment voids the contract. The man had said it himself. Contractors did not work for free. It was the one absolute in an operation that had been built entirely on the absence of absolutes. "I'm certain." And Lobo felt the second freeze shortly after. The delay in the clearinghouse confirmation had gone from 3 minutes to 19. That was not a technical lag. That was an administrative hold, which meant someone had filed something somewhere, and the machinery that processed money had paused to look at it. He had seen this pattern once before on a job that had gone sideways through no fault of his own in a system that operated nothing like this one, but followed the same underlying logic. When the institutional infrastructure around a payment starts moving against it, the payment slows before it stops. He was on a rooftop in Sumit Award, looking at the city in the early morning. The gray circles on the public emergency map were still there, 17 of them, the relay points he'd separated from the network 2 days prior. The engineering teams were working through them. He could see on the public system the slow return of coverage. One gray circle had gone green before dawn, another by mid-morning. They were getting it back, piece by piece. at the pace that people who haven't slept enough and are working with reduced equipment manage to get things back. He looked at his device. The clearinghouse confirmation was now showing a 26-minute delay. The secondary instrument had a status flag he hadn't seen before, under review processing suspended pending jurisdictional verification. He read the flag twice. He knew what it meant. He had been in this position before, not often, but enough to recognize the shape of it. The money was being looked at. Once the money was being looked at, the timeline was no longer his. He sat down on an 8V AC housing on the rooftop and thought about the remaining deliverables. The condition target, the threshold measurement, was at the level the contract specified. He had checked it against the delivery parameters before dawn. The Hero Society's functional coordination was degraded. The legitimacy question was open and not closing. The institutional confidence index that the broker's brief had specified as the primary metric was by any reasonable assessment below the contracted threshold. The job was by the letter of the scope complete. The remaining submissions in the drop channel were not completion conditions, they were extensions. Additional terms that would have continued degrading the system past the threshold, making recovery harder, deepening the damage. He had accepted one. He had not yet acted on it. He looked at the device again. The primary guarantee's processing delay was now 31 minutes. He thought if the payment stops before the extension work is complete, the extension work is void. No payment, no obligation. That's the contract. He thought, if I act on the outstanding brief now before the freeze completes, I am acting on a contract that may not pay. He thought about this for approximately 40 seconds. In the specific way that a professional thinks about a financial risk, not with moral weight, not with strategic calculation, just with the clean arithmetic of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that working for free is not something that happens on purpose. He closed the extension submission without acting on it. He stood up. He stretched. He looked at the city one more time. The lights coming on in the evacuation centers as the morning shift started, the emergency vehicles moving through the cleared corridors, the 17 gray circles and the 2 green ones. He put his device in his jacket. Job's done. To no one. A contractor's notation. He walked to the rooftop access door and went down to find the Space Hog. The primary guarantee was fully suspended late that morning. The legal team confirmed it within minutes. The president read the confirmation. A long moment passed. Get me the disclosure package. The disclosure package had been ready since the prior evening. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was a documented account of what had been authorized by whom, through what mechanism, and what the mechanism had produced, prepared by the legal advisor who had remained after the others left, in consultation with the Commission's surviving institutional credibility, which was not much, but was enough to make the document legible as something other than damage control. It went to the domestic government ministries first, then the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, then through a channel that All Might had kept open since the night before, to the international bodies that had been asking for it since the travel advisories began. It did not fix anything. It did not restore the dispatch system or reconstruct Tartarus, or bring back the hero agencies that had suspended operations, or rebuild the 3 years of brand equity that had evaporated in 8 days. What it did was establish a paper record that said this happened, this is who authorized it, and the authorization exceeded any mandate this body was ever given. That record was the beginning of scrutiny, which was different from reckoning itself, which would take much longer, which was a problem for the weeks and months that followed. Deku was at the gymnasium shelter when the notification came through Primary Response Network restoration in progress. Estimated full capacity, 36 to 48 hours. He read it twice. He passed the phone to the shelter coordinator, a woman in her 50s, who had been running the logistics of this space for 4 days straight and had not, to his knowledge, slept more than 3 hours in any given stretch, and watched her read it. She looked at the number, 36 to 48 hours. Her face did something complicated. The shelter coordinator looked at the number. That's 2 days. Yes. We've been doing this for 4 days without it. Yes. She handed the phone back. She went to the supply table and started counting inventory. Because what the notification meant in practical terms was that the structure they had built here, the distribution system, the watch rotation, the informal mutual aid that had grown up around the shelter in the past 3 days needed to hold for 2 more days before the formal system could take over. And counting inventory was how you found out if it would hold. Deku watched her count. He watched the room. The families still here fewer than yesterday, some having returned to their districts as the situation stabilized, others still waiting. The young heroes doing their rotations. The civilians who had stopped waiting to be helped and started helping. The particular texture of a community that had been forced to organize and had organized not perfectly, not without conflict, but enough. He thought about the word symbol, about what it meant to be one. And what happened when the symbol became the goal, instead of the thing the symbol was pointing at. He had spent enough time thinking about All Might to know the difference. All Might had always known that the symbol was pointing at something, at the fact that people could be safe, that someone would come, that it was possible to be that person. When the symbol became damaged, All Might had found ways to keep pointing at the thing itself, even without the power to perform it. That was the lesson. Not that symbols were worthless, that they were downstream of the thing. He picked up his notebook. He wrote for 10 minutes, not analysis, just observation. What he had seen in the past 4 days, what had held, what hadn't, what the people around him had done when the system stopped doing it for them. He capped the pen and looked at the room. Keep going, he thought. Not heroically. Just as a simple operational instruction, the same one the shelter coordinator was following right now, counting supplies at the table, making sure what needed to hold would hold. He went back to work. The space hog was where he'd left it. Parking structure Chuo Ward, level 2, and no one had touched it, which was the correct professional judgment, by anyone who had looked at it and considered the option. Lobo checked it over with the brief efficiency of someone who has checked over a lot of vehicles and knows exactly what to look for. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The transit damage from the dimensional approach had been repaired on day 1. The fuel state was nominal. The hook was stowed. He mounted up. He sat for a moment, engine idling, looking at the parking structure's concrete ceiling. The clearinghouse confirmation was now showing suspended regulatory review, pending which was a status he had not seen before on this particular channel, but which he recognized as terminal. The money was not going to move. The extension scope was void. The primary scope was complete. He pulled out his device and accessed the drop channel one last time. 4 submissions pending, all flagged payment hold. The freeze had propagated to the submission infrastructure, which made sense. The whole thing was running on the same financial backbone. He closed them all without reading the briefs. No payment, no consideration. That was the job. He put the device away. He looked at the parking structure exit the ramp that led up to street level, where if he rode out, he would be in a city that was in the early stages of putting itself back together after 11 days of what he had done to it. He did not feel responsible for this. He had been paid to produce a condition, and he had produced it, and the people who had made the decision to purchase that condition were in the process of being held to account for it in the particular way that institutions are held to account slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of documentation and very little speed, but moving. He did not feel good about this either. Feeling things about completed jobs was not something he had ever found useful, and he had long since stopped doing it. What he felt the closest approximation of a feeling that the main man permitted himself to register was something in the neighborhood of professional satisfaction. The job had been interesting. The target had been unusual. The kid with the green hair had asked the right question. The man with the blonde hair had known which room to stand in. These were things that did not often happen on this scale in this kind of work. He revved the engine. He rode up the ramp and out onto the street. Tokyo was quiet in the midday lull. Not empty, not normal, but the specific quiet of a city that has moved past acute crisis and into the longer, less legible work of recovery. Traffic was sparse. A hero rescue team was moving through the next block, probably heading toward one of the gray circle districts. A food distribution operation was running out of a parking lot 2 intersections down. He rode through it without stopping. He took the expressway north, because north was as good as any direction when a job was done, and the next one hadn't come in yet. At the edge of the city, he looked back once, not with anything specific in mind, just looked. Then he faced forward and opened the throttle and left. Now, 3 weeks later, a parliamentary committee convened to examine the scope of authority exercised by the Hero Public Safety Commission in the activation of the deployment provision. The committee's terms of reference were 31 pages. The expected duration of the inquiry was 18 months. The commission's legal structure was suspended pending the inquiry's findings. Its functions, licensing coordination oversight, were transferred to a provisional body jointly administered by the government ministries and a newly formed civilian review panel, the composition of which was itself the subject of ongoing negotiation. The Hero system did not collapse. This is worth saying plainly, it did not collapse. What it did was contract, shrink back to a smaller, more local structure in which the gap between what the system promised and what it could deliver had become too visible to maintain at its prior scale. Agencies that had overextended found their sponsor commitments drying up and returned to regional operations. The billboard chart was suspended indefinitely. A licensing reform bill was introduced in the lower house and had at last count sufficient support to pass. Deku was not on the billboard chart when it was suspended because he was still technically a student. He was, however, on the Provisional Body's Community Liaison Committee, a role that carried no rank and no salary, and required him to attend meetings in rooms with very bad coffee and explain to administrators what had actually happened in the shelter networks and the informal mutual aid structures that had filled the gap when the formal system went gray. He attended every meeting. He drank the coffee. He explained what he had seen. All Might sat in the gallery at the committee's first public session and said nothing. His presence was noted in the press. His statement, released through UA's communications office that evening, was 11 lines. It did not apologize for what the system had been. It described what he believed the system could be in terms specific enough to be useful and honest enough to acknowledge the distance between those two things. Hawks filed his sealed folder with the parliamentary committee as primary evidence and was listed as the lead informant witness for the inquiry's first phase. He was asked whether he had authorized the original broker contact. No. He was asked whether he had known about it before day 5. No. Both answers were accurate. He did not elaborate. Endeavor, by contrast, did not attend the session at all. He was holding a line at a recovery site in Nishi Shinjuku, where structural aftershocks were still affecting a residential block. His written statement was 3 paragraphs. The last one read, "The question of what a hero owes is not one I am able to answer in a committee room. I can answer it where I am." The broker was not located, identified, or brought to any proceeding. The clearinghouse through which the deployment provisions payment infrastructure had run was shuttered by regulatory action 6 weeks after the freeze. Its records, to the extent they were recoverable, were entered into evidence. Whether they led anywhere useful remained at the time of writing an open question. Lobo took a contract in a different star system 11 days after leaving Tokyo. The brief was straightforward. The payment was adequate. The job was the kind of job that did not require thinking about anything except the scope and the deliverable. He completed it in 4 days. He did not think about the city he had left behind. He did not think about the kid with the green hair or the question that had been asked correctly, or the way the man with the blonde hair had picked up his phone in a dormitory common room before sunrise and asked who first, as if the answer were something that could still matter. He did not think about it because it was done. And done things were behind him, and he was in the business of the next one. What he did once on the second day of the new job for approximately 3 seconds, for no reason he could have articulated, was sit on a rock on a planet whose name he had already forgotten and look at its sun and think that was a good problem. Then he got up and went back to work.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.